Although I grew up in the 90s, I didn't really get into gaming until the early 2000s, unless you count the handful of hours I spent trying and repeatedly failing at Pitfall on my sister's Atari when I was barely old enough to read. It wasn't until I got a console of my own, the Dreamcast, that I started to see what I had been missing out on and my passion for gaming truly began. Because of this, and the fact that I was 3 years old when the original Doom came out, I don't have any nostalgia associated with the blocky, pixelated 90s first-person shooters now lovingly referred to as boomer shooters, but in spite of this, I'm gonna go ahead and sound like an old man for a moment anyway. Shooters today just are not very fun. It feels like most major shooter franchises are trying so hard to justify charging $60 to $70 price points with massive skill trees, loot boxes, battle passes, even bland stories that somehow manage to be both boring and way too intrusive to the gameplay at the same time. Special exception to Titanfall 2 and 2016's Doom, those campaigns are awesome. Dread Templar is the first FPS in recent memory that I've actually had trouble putting down. Once I took the time to properly invest in it, it was intensely, shamelessly fun and wasn't trying to be anything else. In a personal way, it's an ironic breath of fresh air for a genre I'd mostly moved on from, and it does that by putting the gameplay and level design front and center. First of all, if you're looking for an interesting story, you have the wrong game and probably the wrong genre. For the most part, I think playing a boomer shooter for its story misses the point in the same way it would to drink a margarita for the nutritional value of the lime. Dread Templar does have some hints of a story beyond the Steam page's description of "You are a Dread Templar who entered hell seeking revenge." These story snippets come in the form of occasional still images between levels with some extremely melodramatic narration, which, depending on your point of view, will either be painfully cheesy or exactly the right amount of it. But realistically, you came here to shoot stuff that explodes into clouds of bloody pixel jello to a soundtrack that's the melodic equivalent of a violent battle cry, and you should honestly expect no more, and thankfully, no less. Dread Templar has the exact sort of chunky, pixelated look you'd expect from a shooter aiming to remember the 90s. It's really effective and does a great job of setting the tone for a fast-paced romp that doesn't take itself too seriously. There are even several visual filters you can add, such as a black and white, sepia, or a psychedelic filter that's surely not meant for people who play sober. The levels themselves are worth calling out too. Every time I started to feel that the locations were getting samey or the enemies were repeating a bit too much, the game would thrust me into a completely new area and the feeling would vanish. While the enemy designs range from very creative to relatively average, pretty much all of them are a great time to fight. I played Dread Templar on normal difficulty, and though I'm not really that great at shooters, I felt that it was a sizable challenge, especially later in the campaign, which is likely to last you for 10 to 15 hours if you're taking some time to find secrets and play some of the side content, which generally felt higher in difficulty and sometimes mixes things up with a platforming challenge or two. And I should emphasize, I really strongly recommend playing as much side content as you can. Much of it is more difficult than what you'll find on the main path and can get frustrating, but the rewards are well worth it. There's also a Guardian mode, which is a glorified tower defense where you take down waves of enemies to protect a crystal in the middle of an area and upgrade your weapons and stats between rounds. I didn't get a ton of time to play through this mode, but what I played was a lot of fun and definitely left me wanting more. Throughout the campaign, you can collect upgrade emblems which allow you to add modifiers to your weapons or character. Regular modifiers can be useful, such as increasing your maximum health or changing the damage output of any particular weapon. But then there are gold modifiers, which at their best can be game-changing, like adding an explosive to the point of every arrow you shoot or turning pistol bullets into fiery projectiles. These modifiers are some of the most fun additions to the game, but it was a shame that it was practically required to do a majority of the side missions to find and equip some of them. This would be less of a problem if you could easily go back and grab them, but the game doesn't have a handy way of pointing out how many secrets or side areas still remain incomplete in a level, making going back a process of replaying everything unless you remember the specific areas you left unexplored. The pace of the game didn't feel as fast as something like Doom, but that's not a knock against it. Dread Templar likes to send many types of enemies at you at a time, and to me a huge part of the fun was having to frantically figure out the best way to disperse of each while keeping the most aggressive enemies at bay. Some of my favorite moments of the game would involve dodging clouds of projectiles from distant enemies while firing my rocket launcher at them in slow motion, all while attempting to headshot nearby enemies with my bow who I knew would close the distance between us in seconds. I did have some frustrating moments at the same time though. Sometimes when you're strafing a group of enemies trying to stay alive, it's easy to fall off the edge of the map and end up back at the latest checkpoint. Thankfully, these are liberally placed so that you never lose too much progress, but losing a winning battle due to a cheat fall was never a good feeling. Similarly, the dash cooldown felt unforgivingly long, making it difficult to rely on it very much in sticky situations and slowing the pace a bit more than I sometimes would have liked. The weapons in Dread Templar don't start out especially interesting, but improve with some fun twists as the game goes on. Your melee weapon, the dual katanas, can either be frantically swung at close range or clipped together to make for a far deadlier projectile. Most weapons in the game have analogous alternate fire modes that often give you a lot more power to work with, but with a catch. In the katana's case, there's a several second cooldown after throwing it where your melee is downgraded to a punch. In the case of the dual pistols, you fire much faster, stronger shots, but deplete ammo much more quickly. My favorite weapon had to be the black bow, which has some of the highest damage output in the game and takes down enemies with a satisfying shing sound, but only holds a handful of arrows at a time and operates on a lengthy cooldown to regenerate them. In general, the game does a fantastic job of forcing you to mix up your arsenal and get well acquainted with each of its 10 plus weapons and their alternate fire modes. Boss fights are especially a challenge. I found that dodging their complex attack patterns required some serious effort, and I often spent time focusing on which weapon's ammo to use up first to do the most aggressive damage so that I could more carefully try not to get hit. The game's soundtrack also does an excellent job of complementing the action, and this is coming from somebody not remotely into heavy metal. It fits the theme really well and definitely ramps up the pulse when things get hectic, with the only downside being that some of the same tracks tend to repeat noticeably often. I tried playing Dread Templar a few different ways. If you like to play with a controller, the game has got you covered with native support and thoughtful button mappings. For those who care, the Steam Deck support is fantastic, with the game running at a mostly solid 60 frames per second by default, with rare drops when it gets busy. That said, despite my having a predisposed preference for controllers, I ultimately found them to be the worst way to play the game. The speed and accuracy required to play well just never felt like a comfortable fit for a gamepad, and every time I tried, I always went back to keyboard and mouse to be able to fine-tune my aim better. Activating gyro aim to fine-tune my shots on the Steam Deck were definitely an improvement, but still a little more finicky than I would have liked. While Dread Templar doesn't do anything new, it doesn't need to. The game thrives in the rush of being able to dodge flurries of attacks while making every enemy around you explode into piles of gratuitous gore. It emphasizes fun level and weapon design to make you feel both powerful and vulnerable in the same breath. For anybody interested in a tight single-player campaign with numerous difficulty settings, plentiful secrets, and challenging side levels that will really test your skills, I don't think you'll be disappointed in Dread Templar. It definitely made a believer out of me.